Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the day when supposedly modernity, the modern day, came to Mirabel. Countless homes were expropriated, and on that day, the Liberals delivered notices to take possession of countless acres of land, and that affected between 1,700 and 3,000 families. That put an end to the towns of Saint-Scholastique and Saint-Monique, but it also affects Saint-Jean-Denis, Saint-Jérusalem, Saint-Antoine-des-Laurentides, Sainte-Sophie, Saint-Placide, Saint-André-Jardanteuil, La Chute, and Sainte-Thérèse-Ouest. All of those towns were affected, and all those affected were, Mr. Speaker, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, children, teachers, farmers, mechanics, agronomists. In 1969, 10,000 people became the expropriated group from Mirabel, and that label, expropriated, would follow them all their lives. After that announcement, the government went to Saint-Scholastique. Jean Marchand, a federal minister, announced between 75,000, there would be between 75,000 and 100,000 jobs. But those jobs didn't really take form, not permanently anyhow. Pierre Elliott Trudeau came to Mirabel. He told us that all of this modernity would bring the world with it. But once Pierre Elliott Trudeau left the room, people did not feel any comfort. Their questions had not been answered. People in my riding had very simple questions, such as, when will we have to leave? What amount will we receive as compensation? How will we receive the compensation? Will we have to go work in Montreal? Where will my children go to school? Mr. Speaker, those were the questions asked and left unanswered, but they were very reasonable questions. That group in the early 70s got together to form a community information center. We remember Jean Raymond, Rita Léonard-Daffon, who passed away in the fall, and we paid tribute to her in this place. They were the heroes, the leaders of those whose land was expropriated. But even when they banded together, they never got an answer to the question as to why the expropriated area was so vast. Now, today, Ottawa knows that they expropriated too much land and that it was basically stealing land. They expropriated 97,000 acres of land in Mirabel. Quebecers know that that amount of land, 97,000 acres, is the amount of all Laval. And it's 3.5 times the surface area of Vancouver. It's 2/3 the surface area of Toronto and half the surface area of Edmonton. Everyone back home knows that it was unreasonable, that it was too much. It's the equivalent of 33 Heathrow airports, 25 Vancouver airports, 25 Los Angeles airports, that surface area. It was theft without fair compensation, because, as was often said in Quebec, Liberals were worth more than Quebecers. Federal offers of compensation were insufficient, and people were living in wait. A lot of them were renters on their own land. They couldn't clear the forests. They couldn't take care of their farms. They were living day by day, surviving, waiting for the day when an Ottawa public servant would knock on their door and tell them to leave. And they thought that their homes might even be burned, because some homes were burned. Families had to leave their homes and rebuild elsewhere. That's what occurred in Mirabel. People were treated as renters in their own homes. They were renters in their own homes, and they might ask the federal government permission to paint a wall. There were stories of people who had to ask public servants permission to do the simplest things in their kitchens. They had to ask Ottawa permission to paint their daughters' rooms pink, and public servants told them that they would prefer it be painted in blue or white. That is a level of psychological violence wrought upon these people by federal public servants. There are examples documented by historians. For instance, the example of Françoise Drapeau-Monette, who is tuning in today. She was offered $1,000 for 20-foot by 20-foot property, but that was well below what the actual value was, according to independent estimators. Ottawa took 20 times more land than they needed, 70% off, 70% less than it was worth on the backs of those who lived there. Federal assessors hit the ground, threatening even lower prices. They wanted to go as fast as possible for a project they claimed was transformational. They told us it would be modern, and in order to achieve this modernness, they encouraged people to take the lowest offer, the first offer. Françoise Courcelle was offered $40,000 for their property. The federal government went to their home and said, if you do not sign today, we'll lower the offer to $10,000. We're not making this up, Mr. Speaker, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of such examples. Public servants came in and stole Mirabel, which is a code, which is against the Criminal Code of Canada. It was very arbitrary. The Aom brothers had two identical parcels of land across from each other. One was offered $60,000 and the other $133,000. And they were told that those offers were non-negotiable, otherwise they would go down the offers. There's a sad economic reality, Mr. Speaker. In the case of expropriation, when those whose land is expropriated are not protected by law, the buyer has all the power. The buyer determines the purchase price. This is a recurring theme in this house. In Mirabel, in the 70s, we were talking about property theft at ridiculous prices, and property was stolen from people who were well-rooted, well-established in their communities, and could not even resettle properly with the amounts that they were offered. Ottawa's assessors recognized and acknowledged that it was unfair. I'm not making that up. But they said that some people remained as renters on their own land, sometimes for as long as 18 years. Well, they said that the federal government had given them good rents, good rental amounts. They said, who are you to complain, you who pay such reasonable rent and have such a good landlord in the federal government? And now some of that land is still uncleared or not used for agriculture because investors could not invest in it. And this is some of the most fertile land in Quebec we're talking about. But those who rented their own land were not allowed to invest in it, were not allowed to improve it. Some rented the land and were never compensated for the improvements they made to the property in order to earn a living. There are a lot of scars, there's a lot of pain that remains because these farms had belonged to many previous generations. There's a story of a man who didn't have enough energy to fight the federal government, and his wife, Marie, didn't want her family's legacy to become decrepit. There are cases of suicide, of domestic violence, of illness, of people being uprooted, and also a lot of reputational harm because in agriculture, reputations are built over generations. And All of that occurred in my riding for no reason. If you talk to Eric Couvret, he will walk up to his family's maple farm at the top of the hill and he'll say, well, here was our friend's home. The federal government burned it because they were doing fire drills and burn drills. And if you go to Laurent, it's a cul-de-sac. There's a fence at the other side. You'll see a neighbor who he was worried about the water quality on his property because the federal government may have contaminated the water. At Finance Committee this week, the Minister of Transport said, we acknowledge that the federal government may have made some mistakes. Some mistakes. Mistakes, Mr. Speaker. The airport opened its doors in 1975 and closed them 30 years later after 3 decades of harm and uprooting and ruining people's lives. Now, there was some retrocession. Brian Mulroney wanted state efficiency, and he thought the government should give back some of that land. They gave back over 80,000 acres. If you go to the UPA in Saint-Scholastique, upon entry, you must pay tribute to Brian Mulroney, who is up on the wall there, because we have some bad memories, but also some good ones. The Harper government, it continued under the Harper government because the government kept 11,000 acres for itself. Retrocessions continued, and just last year, the last 5 lands were returned to their original residents. So the scars are fresh, Mr. Speaker, but we have a duty to remember. To all those whose land was expropriated who are tuning in today, we have a duty to remember them. We have a duty also to remember those who are no longer among us, but whose grandchildren are still around. And the Federal Industry Minister is one such person. There were fights, some land was returned, but there was never an official apology. Mr. Speaker, I feel that these individuals deserve an apology from the federal government. That's what we need for closure. That's what the federal government called for. That's what was called for in 2019 at the 50th anniversary of the expropriations. I tabled a motion to this effect with the members for Rosemont La Petite Patrie and Louis Saint-Laurent Akiawenrak last year. A motion that the Conservatives refused to have tabled. And this is the backdrop to the high-speed train file. We're not talking about a train today, we're talking about justice. The Minister of Transport has told me that I'm scaring people, that I'm bringing up old ghosts just to scare people, drum up fear. Well, people in my riding, who can blame them for still feeling afraid? My constituents are very real people. They can follow along with what we're doing. And I'm sure they are even capable of forgiving the government. But it's normal, it's only natural that they should not trust this federal government after having gone through hell at the federal government's hands. After those events, Canada passed modern rules and laws on expropriation with fairer compensation, but also giving people the right to appeal the expropriation, giving people the right to be heard by a commissioner before the minister can decide on the value of land. And there has to be justification for what occurred in 69, 70, 71, because at the time we were told that without that massive expropriation, Canada would not accomplish much. We were told that it was essential and that the project had to move ahead as quickly as possible.
And they broke the lives of people for decades just to save a month or two in time. And we had the duty to find reconciliation. And for the minister, I realized this was a a prime minister, former prime minister, he inherited this from his father, this airport in Mirabel. Well, at least it would be nice to see planes fly there. We said it was a new government. I want to believe them, but we judge governments by their actions. Often we talk about the financial cost of these big projects. We say they cost a lot. We have to accelerate them. And these are generational investments. And this may be true, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of the TGV high-speed train project, which drummed up all of this pain, we believe that this is a generational project, but it does have a human cost. Broken lives, and we don't really talk about the scars and the traces that these damages leave. It's very human, and it is the role of members of Parliament, one of the roles of members of Parliament, to talk about this in the House, to make people understand the situation, and to explain to the House that Mirabel for Quebec and Canada is a place of memory. And it reminds us, Mr. Speaker, as we say often, this could have happened to any of us. It could have happened in any of our ridings. It could have happened in any of our villages or towns. And this could happen again. The government apologized on several occasions. Prime Minister Trudeau apologized to a lot of people, to a lot of groups, for mistakes or crimes that shouldn't have occurred. And this is legitimate, and we agree with this, Mr. Speaker. But in Mirabel, every time a Prime Minister stood up and apologized to someone else and forgot us, it just brought back all the pain. And unless we heal today, we won't be able to end this story. We need the government to apologize and not do this again. And I'm convinced that the government would be willing to do so. And I be the first person to invite them to my riding to do so. And we are welcoming people in my riding. An apology would end the indifference. It would show the will to understand, because if you don't hang around people in my riding, you won't understand them. And these are people who have known pain and battles, closed doors, and politicians with their heads in the sand. And an apology would be a gesture of dignity. Apologizing and recognizing the mistakes, starting again, is one of the first civilized things we teach our children. It's important. And in our lives, Mr. Speaker, we have to say sorry and apologize. Because as you know, those who apologize, those who ask for an apology, rather, are waiting to pardon others. They want this 50-year battle to not last for a century. People who ask for apologies don't want to continue to fight just for the sake of fighting. And I'd like to say that if this House or this government refuses to apologize to Mirabel, we won't just be refusing an apology, it'll be a pardon. It's the opportunity to pardon that we'll be turning our backs on. And I am deeply convinced, as the member for Mirabel, that this will not be the intention of this government. Thank you very much. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Mirabel expropriations are part of our history. We have to recognize this because, yes, we have to know how these lives were upset and how communities were torn apart. I know the agricultural sector very well, and I know how important families are to them, but times have changed, and public consultations are now legally required. And yes, the process will be respectful. I met with the mayor of Mirabel. I met with farmers there and citizens there. And yes, we're going to do what is necessary. And the bloc has to stop blocking things, blocking this major project for our region. And the TGV fully respects this legislation, and I would ask our bloc friends to stop blocking things and to stand up to support this project. The honourable member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member de Therese de Blainville for her question. At the beginning of her question, I heard some sensitivity that we're not used to hearing. We know how she treats people from Pacor, but I thought she was making a step. And then 20 minutes after posting on her Facebook her meeting with the mayor of Mirabel, the mayor also posted a video on Facebook saying that for the time being there was still no social license for the TGV project. But that's not what we're talking about today, Mr. Speaker. What we're talking about today is something very noble and humble. It's to present an apology. And the member has said that the federal government won't do this again, and I want to believe her and in good faith, have good faith. But the first step to ensure that this won't happen again, Mr. Speaker, is quite simply to recognize the mistakes of the past and to allow these people to move on. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Côte-du-Sud, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I have a very long writing name. First, I'd like to thank and congratulate my colleague from Mirabel for his speech, because it was showing a great deal of compassion for the citizens of his riding. He's right to say that when we work on the Hill and in our ridings to represent people, we have to represent those who elected us, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague. And he mentioned in his speech that over the years and everything that happened in Mirabel, it was a nightmare for many people in his riding back then. He wasn't a member of parliament back then. He was very young. But over time, some apologies were made through various conservative and liberal governments that were in power. I'd like to know, what else does he expect for his citizens? The honourable member for Mirabel. Yes, there were retrocessions in the 80s under the Mulroney government. There were retrocessions under the Harper government. And the last retrocessions ended under the Trudeau government. It was a very long process. But throughout the entire process, the federal government never accepted anything else but it being an administrative error. And what people in my riding want is an apology from the Prime Minister on behalf of the Canadian government to recognize what happened in Mirabel was a crime, and that should never happen again, Mr. Speaker. But once again, the Conservative Party was often very open and understanding of people in Mirabel, and I think today we've almost done this marathon. There's just one last step to be made, and I'm convinced that the House will have the necessary compassion to ensure that this step can be made. Thank you. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my colleague for his speech. I say this very honestly. It's one of the best speeches I've heard in 6.5 years since I've been a member. And now we've just understood and seen that the Liberals have announced their position through the member of Therese de Blainville, and they're using 40-year-old slogans rather than presenting an apology to the citizens of Mirabel. Can my colleague explain to the Liberals what we're talking about today so that they understand once and for all what is before the House today is much more important than petty gains and slogans? The honourable member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, it's a day of debate today, and I see the transport minister is here. I see other members here. And during my speech, I saw Quebec members who were almost crying. And I refuse to think that the government's position could just be so insensitive as to what the member for Thérèse de Bainville stated. Sometimes debate gets heated at committee, but we know how to talk behind the scenes, and I know that the minister is a reasonable man, and he is able, Mr. Speaker, and I am convinced that he would recommend to his government to move on so we don't have to hear about this again. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we are very sensitive and taking action. I just wanted to say that in terms of PACCAR, I've already been taking action since October. We have been working with the management team there. The industry is involved, as is the cabinet. I am involved as well. We don't need the bloc to tell us that we had to get involved. This has already been going on since October, and solutions are coming, Mr. Speaker. So against this backdrop, we know how to manage this, and we're not writing to the finance minister. It's because this had to be addressed to the Minister of Industry. We're working with people on the ground to listen to them and take action with them. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm the finance critic. I speak to the finance minister. And I'm sure it's not my first reflex to speak to the member of Thérèse de Blainville. She's not a minister. But when I went to see people at PACCAR, do you know what? Do you know what, Mr. Speaker? I spoke to these people. I shook their hands. We went there, and it's the member Thérèse de Blainville is changing the subject, and I would ask her to think about the history of Mirabel and to become more sensitive and aware, and I would ask her perhaps to review her attitude. The Honourable Member for Aurora Oak Ridges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank our colleague from the bloc for that very impassioned speech. Obviously, he cares very much about the subject, very much about his constituents in his writing. I'm keenly aware of the Mirabel situation, being a Quebecer myself, having been born in Montreal. But, Mr. Speaker, I just want to highlight once again that it was Brian Mulroney, a Canadian Prime Minister, in his very first term that returned 80% of those lands. And again, it was a Canadian Prime Minister in his first term, Stephen Harper, that made retribution with the other 11,000 acres that were returned back to the rightful owners. But in between, Mr. Speaker, we've had numerous years of Liberal governments that have totally ignored the subject. And I'm kind of taken aback by the member from the Liberal Party who's trying to change the subject, not really deal with the issue at hand here. So I'd like to ask the member this question. Why is it that why does he think the Liberals have totally ignored this issue, a very important issue for the people of Mirabel and indeed the people of Quebec?
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. My colleague is showing that this is not a partisan issue. I even tabled a motion last year with the member for Louis Saint Laurent and the NDP, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite-Patrie. This is not a partisan issue. And the Conservative Party, a progressive Conservative Party and the Conservative Party have shown them to be particularly sensitive in the past. They want to recognize the situation, and they're able to say so. And today, I don't want to rehash what the Liberals didn't do in the past, because today they have an opportunity to make a step forward. And I am extending a hand. We are extending a hand. And I think it was clear in my speech. I think my speech was clear. We're extending a hand, and we hope with all our hearts that this motion will be adopted, so we'll never have to discuss this again.